the welcome and thank you. Before we dive into the welcome and agenda for the meeting, I just wanted to go over a few housekeeping things. In the interest of keeping this meeting under an hour, we are not going to be fielding any questions during the meeting. However, we welcome you to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to type any questions that you have throughout the meeting. And following the meeting, we will be posting a Q&A from the questions that we received during this meeting on San Jose's website, so you can get responses to your questions there. We'll also be posting a recording of this meeting, so if there's anything you want to go back and re-listen to or share with other folks who were not able to join today, that recording will be posted about a week or so after today's meeting. So let's just dive into the agenda to get things started. We'll go over a quick overview. Do you mind going back just one slide, Mark, to the agenda? We'll go over a really quick overview of what the intent of today's meeting is for, and then a high-level background of the city's rent stabilization program and what RSG's study has been looking into. We'll share some summarizing findings from the stakeholder engagement series of meetings that we've hosted over the past month and a half. Share some of what the next steps are for the city and RSG in the coming months, and then conclude the meeting. It shouldn't go over an hour. We're trying really hard to make sure we keep it under that time frame for you all. So going over to the next slide. And then the one after that. So today's goal is to just share out some of the findings that we heard from all of the stakeholder groups during our series of meetings over the past month and a half. We got a ton of feedback from stakeholders that are tenants of apartments, landlords of apartments, mobile home residents, and mobile home park owners. We collected this feedback in the form of an online survey, in virtual meetings, in-person meetings, through handouts. And our goal today is to just kind of share some of the findings that we have collected from and heard from all of you. On to the next slide. So in order to kind of set a foundation for today's meeting and expectations, we're simply presenting this feedback as we heard it from the stakeholder groups. We want to just kind of give you a brief overview of what all the data is. There is quite a bit of data, so not everything that we heard will be shared today, and a lot of this data will be used later on to help inform the city's efforts in putting together a strategic draft plan, and will also be summarized in a report that RSG puts together for the city. We will not be fielding questions. It's not going to be a live feedback, a live discussion, just in the interest of keeping this meeting under an hour. However, we do want to hear your feedback and hear your questions. So if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A function, and we will be posting responses to your questions after this meeting on the city's website. And additionally, anything that we're reporting in this meeting is just what we've been collecting. We're not sharing these as recommendations. And, this is not changes that the city is making at this moment. We are just trying to be transparent and share what we've heard from you. We can go to the next slide and slide after that. So a little bit of background on the city's rent stabilization program. I'm sure all of you know this all by this point, and we went over it in the various stakeholder meetings that we've held. But just to recap, the city's rent stabilization program is made up of many ordinances, and we're just going to go over those. So the tenant protection ordinance outlines 13 just causes under which a landlord must cite in order to evict a tenant from one of their properties. The apartment rent ordinance is what establishes a cap on rent increases per year for landlords of apartments, and also outlines a petition process for landlords to ensure they get a fair return on their properties. the mobile home rental ordinance, very similar to the apartment rent ordinance, that establishes a rent cap for mobile home landlords, which is 75% of the local CPI, and is capped at, must be between 3% and 7%. Similar to the apartment rent ordinance, the mobile home rent ordinance outlines a process for landlords who to petition for fair return on their properties. Next slide. The Ellis Act ordinance is one of the 13 just causes that falls under the TPO, and it provides a way for landlords who wish to remove their rental property from the rental market, either for redevelopment or constructing a new property on that area, and establishes a relocation assistance that landlords must pay to their tenants, as well as some other regulations under the Ellis Act ordinance. And then lastly, the Housing Payment Equality Ordinance is an anti-discrimination ordinance that protects potential tenants who have housing vouchers from being discriminated against in the rental application process. So those are the ordinances that we have been looking into and asking for your feedback on over the past, throughout the stakeholder engagement process. The city's goals and purpose with this study and what RSG is assisting the city with is answering some key questions about all of these ordinances, about how they've been impacting you all as stakeholders in the city, what have been the benefits and the challenges of these ordinances, and any recommendations that stakeholders have on how to improve these ordinances and improve affordability and renting for any sort of landlord or tenant in the city. All of the feedback that we've been hearing will assist the city in developing a strategic draft plan for guiding the city in the years to come on how they want to run the rent stabilization program. So with that, we'll go into the findings. And again, I just want to reiterate that we are presenting these findings as we heard them from the various stakeholder groups, and there was a lot of information that was collected throughout all of the surveys and in-person and virtual meetings. And so these have been really distilled down to try and summarize them. And we have all the other information that's been collected, and that will be used to inform the report and strategic plan that RSG will be helping the city put together. So the first stakeholder group we're going to be talking about are tenants of apartments. In general, what we heard from tenants was that the 5% increase cap is necessary to keep housing affordable. Many tenants felt that they're already rent burdened and struggling to keep up with this cap, and that it was critical in making sure that they were able to stay in their units. Another thing that we heard consistently from tenants was that there's a desire for greater outreach and communication from the city to ensure that both landlords and tenants understand all of the ordinances and the enforcement of regulation. And tenants mentioned this could be in the form of training or simply better outreach materials to just make sure that tenants are aware of their rights, landlords are aware of what they can and can't do, and all parties know what the processes are if there's ever a violation of any of the ordinances. Another major comment that we heard from tenants was a fear of eviction due to inability to pay rent increases, especially considering that wages have been stagnating and rent increases are still going up every year, and a general fear of retaliation if a tenant were to issue a complaint against their landlord, either for issues such as maintenance of the property or rent increases or anything. That was a common thread that we heard throughout our meetings. In addition to another element of this was the fact that many tenants had mentioned that they wanted there to be greater protection for vulnerable communities, those with language barriers racial minorities, seniors, people with disabilities, making sure that this information is being shared with those groups intentionally, and that the city is doing their best and landlords are doing their best to bridge any sort of accessibility gaps. And then the final comment that we heard consistently from tenants was to expand rent stabilization to cover more units, including duplexes and newer units, since currently the ARO only covers those units that are built before 1979 and properties with 3 or more units. Go to the next slide. So these were the kind of summary of comments that we heard from landlords. Again, there was so much more that we heard, and we did our best to distill all of that down into a few bullet points for the purposes of this PowerPoint. And many of landlords talked about how challenging it was to get a fair return on their property and felt that the ARO did not do the best job at guaranteeing them a fair return. Due to the fact that the 5% cap has been below what inflation has been in recent years, and that the petition process for getting a fair return is quite burdensome in terms of cost and time. Many landlords talked about the fact that even if they are able to get a successful petition for a fair return, the 3% pass-through doesn't always cover the repair costs that landlords are having to cover on their properties. And so especially when those are coupled with each other, or there are multiple repairs year over year, it can be really difficult for the landlord to catch up with those and feel that they're falling behind and not getting a fair return. We also spoke with landlords about the rent registry and heard that it can be a very significant administrative burden on landlords, especially for those with many units, and having to enter each of their units into the rent registry every year. And whenever there's a change in tenancy or rent for that unit, the fact that the rent registry itself can be quite have a bad user interface and difficult to access at times for older landlords or those who may not be as technologically adept. Also the fact that the time of year that the rent registry opens and notices are issued can be difficult for landlords. The next comment that we heard from landlords was that tenant protections prevent their ability to remove problematic tenants, and that the evictions can be cost and time prohibitive. This was one of the most consistent comments that we heard across our meetings with landlords. It has been very difficult for landlords who have tenants that cause nuisances for other tenants in the area, or are have guests that are coming over and causing issues for tenants in the area. Landlords feel that their only course of action in dealing with tenant issues is eviction. And unfortunately, it's really expensive and takes a long time to process, and have not been able to exercise adequate control. Landlords feel that they haven't been able to exercise adequate control over their properties due to the tenant protections. And then lastly, similar to what we heard from tenants, landlords would just like to see greater partnership between the city and advocacy groups, including greater representation and legal support for landlords. One comment that we heard from a few different landlords was the fact that tenants get significant legal support from the city in terms of the Law Foundation and other resources. And landlords feel that they are not getting that same support and would like to have it, since they're having to deal with the same issues just on the other end. We can go to the next slide. So next we'll go over what we heard from the mobile home stakeholders, starting with the residents. Residents generally felt that the mobile home rent ordinance was adequate in keeping mobile home rents. That we heard from that stakeholder group was that information about space rents, utility upgrades, and other changes and things that are going on at the parks was not always accessible. And those residents wanted to see stricter enforcement of regulations around posting that sort of information to make sure that residents are kept aware of what's going on at their park and are aware of their rights and these policies that affect them. Again, similar to what we heard from the apartment tenants, many vulnerable populations rely on mobile homes for affordable and independent housing, particularly seniors. These residents want to make sure that these posting policies are inclusive of these groups and prioritize protecting these groups by making sure information is accessible in multiple languages, accessible to those who are at the park and may not have access to all to technology, like modern technology, and that they are getting the same information that everyone else is getting. Next slide. And then the last stakeholder group that we spoke to were park owners of mobile homes. Very similar to what we heard from landlords of apartments, they also are finding it challenging to get a fair return due to the 75% of CPI cap. Many park owners feel that they're also not able to keep up with the rate of inflation with this cap and are falling a little bit behind each year. Especially when you add on the fact that there have been increasing property taxes, city fees, maintenance costs, and so on that make it even more difficult for them to keep up with, even more difficult to get a fair return on their properties. The fact that mobile home parks don't have any vacancy decontrol also disincentivizes park owners from making those repairs during vacancy periods, just because they feel like they're not going to be able to recoup those costs. And so unfortunately, that means that parks aren't able to be maintained at the standard that tenants and landlords may want them to. It's also a very difficult petition process for park owners to get a fair return because they have to provide documentation going all the way back to the base year, which is 1985. Many park owners don't have access to that kind of documentation, and it's also just very time consuming and can be costly to submit that petition process. The mobile home park owners are in a slightly different situation than apartment landlords because their eviction matters are regulated under different policies and are overseen by the state. And so park owners noted that they would prefer the city to avoid adding complicating regulations, and since they are already overseen by state civil code. And then lastly, that the park owners would like to see greater partnership between the city and advocacy groups to ensure that regulations are communicated effectively and park owners are included in the decision-making process of the city. So I know we just threw a whole bunch of really dense information at you. And like I said before, this is just a high-level summary of all of the information that we received. So we wanted to try and condense it down even further into some of the major themes that we were noticing across all stakeholder groups. And those were city transparency, making sure that the city is being really upfront about what these policies are, who they impact, when, what courses that landlords and tenants have when there's any sort of violation of the policy. Stakeholder groups want to see transparency around the enforcement of these policies, what the city is doing, and what fees are going to, and so on. Also, a major topic was cultural relevancy and protecting vulnerable populations. It seems very important to everyone in the city to make sure that these groups are able to keep affording living where they live and are protected, that information is being presented in a way that doesn't create additional barriers for this group. The next bullet point is education about the ordinance and this sort of falls under city transparency, just making sure that new tenants, new landlords, all stakeholders are aware of what these policies are and how they impact landlords and residents in the city. Greater partnership between city and advocacy groups, making sure that the city is recognizing the fact that landlords and tenants have firsthand experience of what the impacts of these regulations and ordinances are, and are utilizing the firsthand knowledge that these groups have and can offer insight, and making sure that their voices are being heard in the decision-making process. And then lastly, equal representation / mediation services for landlords and tenants. Many landlords spoke about the fact that they feel their only course of action whenever there's a problem with a tenant is eviction. And this is not the ideal course that they would like to take, just because it's super expensive, it's time consuming, and they don't want to make their tenants homeless. So the idea of mediation services or an ambassador program to help kind of create a bridge between landlords and tenants and resolve issues rather than just going straight to eviction was definitely something that we heard across many stakeholder groups. So in addition to all of this qualitative information that we collected, we also asked participants to respond to quantitative questions as well. And we collected a lot of different data on how these ordinances were impacting you, your familiarity with these ordinances, and so on. And again, we are only presenting a few graphs from that data. But just know we are using and analyzing all of the data that we collected from you. But this first graph is in response to the question, how effective do you feel the apartment rent ordinance is at ensuring that rental housing remains affordable in the city? And we are showing our responses from both landlords and tenants here. Again, we're not drawing any significant conclusions from this data at this time, but just wanted to kind of share what we're seeing as we look through it all. In general, it tends to look as though landlords feel that the ARO is more effective than tenants do. And this makes sense just because landlords know that they could be increasing their rents higher if there was no rent control. And so they see the impact of rent stabilization in managing affordability, whereas tenants seem to be on the other side of that, leaning towards the fact that the ARO is maybe not as effective. And that makes sense because tenants are feeling that they're still not able to keep up with rent increases. Next slide. And then the second slide shows the responses to the question, how effective do you feel the tenant protection ordinance is at protecting tenants from wrongful evictions? And this also aligns very much with what we were hearing from landlords and tenants in the feedback sessions. As you can see, majority of landlords marked that it is very effective, and that kind of aligns with the feedback that we were hearing that it's almost too effective, and landlords are not able to remove tenants that are causing problems for their property and their neighbors due to the protections in the tenant protection ordinance. Whereas tenants seem a little bit more spread out, but leaning towards the fact that they feel this ordinance is effective. And so there's definitely an imbalance there that will be looked into further throughout the study. At this point, I'm going to hand things off to Mark. So feel free to take it away, Mark.
Thank you, Sam. One of the other things that RSG has done on behalf of the city, we interviewed 6 comparable jurisdictions that also have rent stabilization programs. 3 of these were cities in the Bay Area, and 3 of these were cities in Southern California, just to try to get a mix of what other cities are doing, what works, what doesn't work, what are their strengths and weaknesses, what are their best practices. And some of these programs are decades old, others have been established more recently, and they all have unique structures, and we were just trying to see what San Jose could learn from these other cities, and also then bring this into any particular recommendations we might make, and how that might get reflected in the draft strategic plan. The other thing we looked at, sorry, I'm having a little technical difficulty. Okay. Was the rent registry. So under the apartment rent ordinance, landlords have to register their units and their rent increases. We've looked at over 150,000 registrations that have been covered through the 4 rent registration periods that have been in effect so far, and trying to glean what we can learn from the data that's in the rent registry, as well as how well the rent registry itself is performing in giving city staff an ability to see what's going on and to follow up. Next steps following the stakeholder engagement and our findings. There will be a link for to this recording, and it will be posted on the city's website. That's the URL there, www.sjhousing.org. The Q&A will also be posted. So if you have questions, please type them into the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and answers will be provided at that link as well. RSG is working with staff to prepare a draft strategic plan, tentatively to go to the Housing and Community Development Commission in this June, and then a final strategic plan to the City Council, perhaps in August. These dates are tentative because we are still working through our findings and what we would like to report, as well as seeing if we need to get some more stakeholder input and other feedback as we bring these plans forward.
Thank you, Mark. So that is the conclusion to our meeting. We really wanted to keep this super short and high level and just kind of share out what we've been working on so far, what we've been hearing from you, and what our next steps are going forward. Like we said, nothing in this meeting is a recommendation to the city, and nothing is being finalized. We are still very much in the data analysis phase, but wanted to be transparent with all of you as to what we've been hearing, and show how grateful we are for all the input you've been providing over the past month. As I've mentioned earlier, we aren't going to be fielding questions in this meeting, just in the interest of keeping it short, but we will keep it open for a little bit longer. So if you have any additional questions you'd like to enter into the Q&A, please continue and feeling free to do that. We will be summarizing all of the questions we receive in the Q&A and providing responses to them, which will be posted online along with the recording of this video. At this point, would anyone from San Jose staff like to make an announcement as we close out?
Hi, thank you, Samantha and Mark, for your presentation and sharing. And I appreciate everyone who my name is Emily Hislop. I'm the division manager of the Rent Stabilization Program. Appreciate everybody who's attended this meeting and who attended and participated in all of our engagement. I just want to emphasize this is an ongoing process, and we're trying to most efficiently present what we've collected so far. But this will not be the only time we're sharing things with the public, and we will continue to keep people involved. And we will capture all the questions you have about our findings and the research done here. And we hope to publish, we plan to publish a Q&A with those answers to those questions on our website within a month. But if there's other input you want to give, we don't want to dissuade anyone, please send us your input via this email, and we will share it with RSG so it can be included in our analysis of how our program is working and how we can improve it. So thank you.
Great. Again, thank you everyone so much for attending this meeting. We'll leave the Q&A open. We'll leave the Zoom open for just a few more minutes so that you can get any last questions you have into that Q&A. But thank you so much for being here, and I hope that you all have a great rest of your day.
We'll keep this open for 2 more minutes and then we'll close. Thank you. 30 more seconds and we'll close it.